Today we're going to do a Bain & Company round 1 case. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt and I'm a current second-year associate at BCG, which is a management consulting firm. And I make these videos because I enjoy it, but also because I would have wished that somebody would have made these for me when I was younger. Today I'm going to be walking you through a Bain & Company round 1 case and showing you my thought process so that hopefully you can tackle this type of case on your own. And one caveat I want to make before we get into this video is that for best results, you should attempt this case on your own before looking through my explanation. But if maybe it's your first time doing this or you're too intimidated to try it on your own, then just keep watching. Let's get into it. So the case that we're going to look at today is called National Logistics. It's representative of a Bain round 1 case. And the prompt reads as follows. Your client is National Logistics, a large transportation and logistics company that delivers freight to all areas of North America. Over the last 5 years, the company has experienced rising costs due to increases in wages resulting from a shortage of truckers. The client is now looking to reduce operational costs in the business. How would you advise the client? Okay, so the first thing we want to do whenever we hear the prompt is we want to be taking quick notes. And after we take notes, we want to basically restate our understanding of the situation to the interviewer and also ask a few clarifying questions. And so I'm going to just take a few seconds now and take some quick notes. All right. So our client is National Logistics. They basically deliver freight all over North America. And over the last 5 years, costs have increased due to wages. And so there's been a shortage of truckers. The question is how to reduce costs. Okay. And so after I take quick notes, the first thing you always want to do is you want to restate to the interviewer your understanding of the situation and also to make sure that you haven't missed out on any crucial details. And so the way I would go about this is I would say, okay, great. So it sounds like our client is National Logistics. They're a freight and shipping company based primarily in North America. And so the problem that they're facing over the last 5 years is that due to a shortage of truckers in the overall transportation and freight industry, their wages have had to increase to attract a sufficient number of drivers. And so they're asking us today, how can we reduce our operational costs to the business, which would thereby increase profitability? And so the next thing you want to do is you want to have a few key questions prepared. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to ask these questions for a couple of reasons, but mainly because you also want to demonstrate to the interviewer that you are paying attention and that you're thinking thoughtfully about the question. So even if you maybe don't have any pressing or burning questions, you should try to come up with at least 1 or 2 questions to clarify the situation. So a few clarifying questions that I can think of off the top of my head, for example, is geographically, are we limited to North America, or is there any plans for potentially international expansion? And then the interviewer might say, no, we're primarily a North America-based company. We want to stay in the same geography. There's no plans to go abroad. Now, you could also ask, have they tried anything already to lower costs? Because this is going to help us understand, has the company even tried anything before and how they're currently thinking about the problem? Because maybe management has been thinking about this a lot, and maybe they have tried a few things but have been unsuccessful, which is why they've brought us on. Or they maybe have not tried anything and they just want us to help them brainstorm a few directions that they could take. So another question, as I said, we could ask is, have they tried anything already? And the interviewer might say, no, they haven't tried anything yet. Management has only recently come to realize that costs were increasing so dramatically over the last 5 years, and therefore they want us to think about as many options as possible to lower operational costs. And I guess just to be holistic, we can try to think of a third clarifying question here. And so we could ask something like, are there any other costs that are rising? Because we know for a fact that wages in the trucking industry have been going up due to this shortage, but is there any other cost that is contributing to this increase in operational costs for trucking and shipping businesses, right? Because maybe wages is number one, but maybe number two is something else. And so we just want to be very sure that we're looking in the right places. And so in response to this, the interviewer might say something like, yeah, there are a few other, rising costs to the business, like, having to repair and maintain the fleet. The costs have gone up recently, but not as significant as the increases in wages over the last 5 years. And so that would tell you that, hey, we really need to be looking into the wages specifically, but as like a secondary area to look, we can look into other costs, like, for example, maintaining and repairing their fleet of trucks. Okay, but now that we've asked our clarifying questions, the next thing you want to immediately do is you want to start coming up with your framework. And so the way you want to go about this is you want to ask the interviewer for 60 to 90 seconds to come up with a framework. How you would do this is you would say, okay, great. Can I just take 60 seconds to structure my thoughts? And the interviewer will always say yes. And this is your cue to kind of go ahead and take some time to think through a framework. And the interviewer will always say, okay, so I've spent about a minute or two putting together a quick framework. And for this case, I'm just using a simple profitability-esque framework. So basically the two main buckets that I've segmented out here are sales as well as costs. And so just to walk you through how you should approach presenting this to the interviewer, you always want to be super clear about the different buckets that you have, and you want to lay it out to them in an extremely logical manner. And so it might sound a little bit like robotic almost to say it like this, but the way you want to do this is you want to be super structured, and you want to say, so the way that I'm thinking about this is I've kind of segmented the two main areas that I want to understand a little bit more. The first is on the revenue side of things. I want to understand that a little bit more. And then the second is the cost side of the equation. And I've included both revenue and costs, even though the question is primarily what can we do to costs, because I think revenue and costs are linked and all both contribute to profitability, which I understand as probably being the ultimate goal for the company. And so going back to the first bucket, sales, here I've broken this out into two buckets, one being pricing and the second being volume. And then under costs, I've broken the costs into two smaller buckets of fixed costs versus variable costs. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of these buckets. So under revenue with pricing, here I really want to understand a little bit more about our pricing structure. How are we actually pricing each shipment? Is it on I would assume that we have some sort of contract with our clients. So a business, for example, that wants to ship its goods around the US would come to us, and then we would therefore sign a contract with them saying, hey, you're going to pay us either on a per shipment basis, so every shipment, or maybe you're going to pay us some sort of combination of a fixed fee plus a variable fee based on how much volume we're shipping for you, or maybe based on the weight of the shipments that we're actually moving for you. But I really want to better understand how exactly we are pricing our shipments. On the volume side, I want to understand a little bit more about the number of deliveries, the volume of deliveries, as well as the number of drivers that we currently have, and any historical and projected trends for those stats. And also on volume, I'm kind of interested in what is the average volume in a given shipment. And the reason I bring this up is because maybe a lot of trucks and a lot of shipments are going out without max capacity. Maybe they're only being 50% utilized. And so maybe there's an opportunity to potentially pack each shipment full with more boxes or more products. But moving to the cost side of things, on the fixed cost side, here I just want to better understand, what are the main sources of fixed costs here. One that I can think of immediately is any overhead costs related to, the corporate side of the business. So salaries, wages, rent for the offices, things like that. I just want to understand that a little bit better and whether there's any leeway to lower those costs. Side note, this is kind of one of the buckets that people think of when they think of consultants going in and advising to lay off a lot of staff at big companies, because a major source of costs can be within overhead, the wages and the salary packages for the employees in the corporate side of the business. But moving to the variable side, here I've kind of broken it out into a few main buckets. The first being labor costs, which we've mentioned. Understand that the wages for drivers has been increasing over time, but wanted to include that to be holistic. Second, any input costs related to actually making the shipments. So these would be things like fuel, for example. Anything that basically increases as you drive a longer distance to complete a shipment. And so these are also things like maintenance costs related to repairing your trucks, for example, because every 100,000 miles, maybe a truck breaks down, and so you need to invest a certain amount of money into repairing that truck or replacing it. And then finally, I've included this kind of other bucket, which would include miscellaneous costs that also are variable, like toll fees, because if you are driving on the highway, for example, you might need to pay certain fees to drive on different roads. But that's kind of a catch-all bucket to include any other potential variable costs that we could look at. Okay, so after this, you would basically want to stop and get the interviewer's thoughts on this framework. And sometimes they will point you in a certain direction and they'll say, great, let's talk about pricing, for example. But other times they might not give you as much direction, and they might say something like, awesome, so where would you suggest we start first? And this is where, don't be intimidated. They're just opening up the conversation for you, and you should just think about which of these buckets you think is most interesting or potentially might be most important for this project. Fully understanding that the goal with a framework is always typically to go through every single bucket in the framework until you've gotten to the root cause of the problem. And so say, for example, in this question, I'm really interested in specifically the trucks and how we can lower costs related to the trucks, whether that be the fuel costs related to the trucks or the maintenance costs. So maybe that means, is there a possibility to invest in more high quality fleets that are also more fuel efficient? And so what I would say to the interviewer is, the first area I want to look into is really investigating the fleet a little bit more. Is there any opportunity? Has management explored the possibility of potentially investing in a more fuel efficient fleet? And the interviewer would give you some feedback on that. Now, obviously, I know the answer to this case, and so I'm guiding us in the right direction. But if the interviewer says, for example, no, they haven't done anything, but there's no plans to look into that in the future, or they've already kind of ruled it out as a possibility, then don't fret. Just go back to your framework and ask them about the second bucket that you find most interesting. And eventually you'll get there. But in this case, the interviewer is going to tell us that yes, we have some data actually related to the cost of operating each truck. And so they're gonna flash this exhibit up on the screen. And the first thing you always wanna do is you want to basically, before you even think about, okay, what does this even mean? You want to talk aloud and explain what you're actually seeing. And so how I would go about this is I would say, oh, awesome. So it looks like we have some financial metrics related to the standard trucks that we currently have, as well as these new hybrid trucks, which are supposedly more fuel efficient. And so we've been given the purchase price, maintenance year, insurance year, average miles driven per year, miles per gallon, vehicle lifespan. And right off the bat, I can see that the hybrid trucks are obviously a lot more expensive because their purchase price is 50% higher. They're $150,000 per truck. But at the same time, they are twice as fuel efficient, and so the miles per gallon is 20 as opposed to 10 for the standard truck. And the lifespan looks to be about the same, but the overall costs for the hybrid trucks appear to be higher. And I see that National Express pays an average of $3 per gallon for fuel. Okay, so we have some metrics related to cost for each gallon. And so after you've given your initial observations about the table, you want to start thinking about any potential questions or analyses that you can run with this data set that could potentially lead to any sort of conclusion. But usually the interviewer will start guiding you towards the calculation or the question that they actually want to see. And so in this particular case, the question would be, we ran 2 cost scenarios for the client to compare the cost of operating a hybrid truck versus a standard diesel truck. What are the potential cost savings, if any, from switching to a hybrid truck? And so I'm going to start just writing some of the costs down from the exhibit onto my paper just so I can start thinking through how I might be able to calculate this. First thing we have is maintenance, which for standard is $5K a year. And then for hybrid, it's $8K a year. insurance is $2K a year for standard, $3K a year for hybrid. And so just totaling those up is already $7K a year for standard, $11K a year for hybrid. And then there is our costs related to fuel. So the average miles driven for a standard truck is 60,000, and for a hybrid truck it's also 60,000. And we basically want to divide that by our miles per gallon, which is 10 and 20. And so that's basically 6. And then multiply by basically the cost per gallon, which in this case is $3. Okay. So on the standard side, we have 60,000 miles divided by 10 miles per gallon. So that gets us about 6,000 times $3 per gallon. So 6,000 times 3 is $18,000. And then on the hybrid side, we have 60,000 miles driven divided by 20 miles per gallon, which gets us about 3,000. 3,000 times $3 per gallon is 9,000. And so right now, it looks like our costs are just, the maintenance plus the insurance plus the fuel costs. But something that we haven't talked about yet is related to the life of each truck, and that is depreciation expense. For those of you who don't know, if you haven't taken an accounting class, depreciation expense is basically just an expense related to the age of the vehicle. If you're confused about depreciation, the way you can think about it is just, look, if I buy a car, for example, the value of that car is going to decrease each year. And so, a 10-year-old car is not going to be worth the same as a brand new car, right? And so how do you account for that on the financial statements? Well, it's through something called depreciation expense. And so a good thing to mention here to the interviewer in this situation would be to just ask. Like, if you're unsure whether or not you should be thinking about this, you should literally just bring it up, because the worst thing they can say is, no, you don't need to factor that into your calculation. And you want that to happen as opposed to you forgetting to ask or just assuming that it's not necessary, and then it messes up your answer. And so I would ask the interviewer, hey, I noticed that we might need to account for depreciation expense. Can I assume, straight line depreciation for the purposes of this case? Straight line depreciation is just when you divide the purchase price of that vehicle by the number of years that it is useful. So in this case, we know the useful life is the vehicle lifespan of 10 years. And so we would just divide the purchase price for the standard truck, which is $100,000, by 10 years to get us to a depreciation expense of $10,000. Sorry if this is really messy. And on the hybrid truck side, we have a purchase price of $150,000, divide that by 10 years. So it's about 15K of depreciation there. And so our total costs are actually this plus this plus this, okay? Which comes out to 11 plus 9 is 20. 20 plus 15 is 35. 35K. 7 plus 18 is 25, plus 10 is 35. So this is really interesting. What we can see here is that the cost base for each of these trucks is roughly equal. And so right off the bat, alarm bells should be going off in your head, and you should be wondering, first of all, this is really interesting, but why? And what does this mean in the context of our project? but you also always want to be telling the interviewer what you're thinking about and what you're seeing. And so right off the bat, you should say, well, this is really interesting. What I'm seeing here is that the costs for the standard truck and the hybrid truck are actually about $35,000 per year each. And so there is no annual cost savings with using either of these, at least from a numerical perspective. There's no benefit. And so you want to talk to the interviewer about your findings, and you want to talk them through what's going through your head. And so you want to tell them something like, as I mentioned, it looks like there are no associated cost savings or cost advantage to using a standard truck versus a hybrid truck. At least from a numerical perspective, there's no reason for us to adopt this hybrid fleet. But that said, there potentially may be other reasons, more qualitative reasons, why you might want to use a hybrid truck as opposed to a standard semi-truck. Maybe, for example, the hybrid truck has a greater carrying capacity for the loads that we want to bring, right? Because that would indirectly lower our number of shipments needed to deliver or complete a trip. You always want to think beyond just the initial finding, because there's often a second or third level of insight that may not be apparent right off the bat from just looking at the numbers. But in this case, the interviewer would say to you, great, well, given the results of the analysis, would you recommend for National Logistics to invest in hybrid trucks? Why or why not? So the question is, should they invest in hybrid trucks? And here I think it's okay to ask for another 30 seconds to think through your response here, because again, you've been given a lot of data already and information, and sometimes it helps to just take a few seconds to process that information. And as long as you're not taking too long here, most interviewers would be okay with you taking a few seconds to just put together some good thoughts. And so what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to put together like a yes versus a no column. And so under yes, we can think of like potential ideas why you might want to invest in hybrid trucks. And under no, you would basically think through reasons that you might not want to invest in hybrid trucks. This way we can have a little bit more of a holistic perspective on both the reasons that someone would or would not do this. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken some time to really think through potential reasons why someone would want to invest in these hybrid trucks versus would not want to. And so I'll walk you through each of my thinking behind each. And so the first bullet under the yes bucket here, it reads, hybrid trucks may be superior in some other way. And so my thinking here was essentially, there could be some other intangible advantage that we just can't see in the numbers that hybrid trucks have. For example, a hybrid truck may be able to carry more boxes, as I mentioned earlier in this video. And that would be a huge benefit if that were true. Also, maybe it's more efficient in some other way and would allow the shipment time to decrease. Now, you might be wondering, how is this possible? Well, one thing I can think of is we can also think about the driver's time as being a source of efficiency. So maybe these trucks are better in terms of navigation. Maybe they have better built-in navigation systems that would allow us to complete trips in a shorter amount of time. Things like that. And so you really would want to ask the interviewer here, like, hey, is there any information about these trucks that would potentially differentiate them in a real big way like this? And based on their response, you can decide whether or not this is impactful or not. But the goal here is you always want to be thinking, again, as I said, beyond just what the numbers show you, and think about any other reasons that could potentially make it a good reason to invest in this new fleet. A good rule of thumb with casing in general is you always want to think about both sides of the coin. So even when there is a conclusion or an analysis or a data set that's shown to you that appears to demonstrate a very clear conclusion or something that to you might seem like, oh, that's a no-brainer, right? Well, you always want to stop and take a few seconds to think about, okay, well, what if I'm not right? What if the answer is the other side of the coin? Why would that be? What are some potential reasons why someone who's taking the opposite side of what I think is right would use to back up their argument? And if you get in the habit of thinking like that, you're not only going to be very good at the job, but you're also going to just get very good at casing. But moving on to the second bullet under yes, I also wrote more efficient and economical if fuel prices increase. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's go back up and look at our numbers here. Based on the numbers that we were given, we concluded, right, that there was no cost benefit because it was $35,000 per year in costs for both a standard truck and a hybrid truck. Now, most people would have stopped here and they would have just accepted this as, okay, that's the end all be all, right? But if we look a little bit closer at the numbers, we can see that In this scenario, the maintenance and insurance costs appear to be pretty fixed, right? They're not going to change too much on a yearly basis. The depreciation expense is also not going to change that much on a yearly basis unless something changes about like the price or the average useful life of each truck. But when it comes to the fuel prices, this is highly variable because it's dependent on three things. It's dependent on how many miles are being driven by each truck. It's dependent on the miles per gallon, and it's also dependent on the cost per gallon. And if we look at all three of these things, let's change colors here. In the scenario that we were given, it was $3 per gallon. But just for argument's sake, let's assume that the price per gallon doubled. And so suddenly, instead of $3 per gallon, this went up to, let's say, 6. Okay? Now, what would happen to our total costs? Well, our maintenance and insurance costs would stay the same. Miles driven, let's just assume that stays the same as well. And miles per gallon, that's not going to change. And so what's our total cost? What's the change to our total costs? Well, we still have our $7,000 per year of maintenance and insurance, plus our new fuel cost now of $36,000, which is roughly $43,000, plus 10, which is $53,000. So this, if you're still following along, goes to $53K. Okay, and then what happens to our hybrid? Well, we have still our $11,000 of maintenance and insurance, but plus now a new $18,000 in fuel, which is roughly $44,000, if I did my math correctly. Call me out if I didn't. But now you can see that there is a difference and that the hybrid truck is actually more worth if the fuel price increases. And so this is where it's a little bit more nuanced than we might have realized before. Because if the cost of fuel increases, then it's worth it to use our hybrid trucks. But on the other hand, if let's say the cost per gallon decreased below $3 per gallon, then what would happen? Well, the opposite would happen. And actually, the standard diesel trucks would be more economical than these expensive hybrid trucks. And so this is why, if we believe that the cost of fuel is going to increase, then it makes sense from a financial perspective to invest in hybrid trucks. But if we believe that the cost of fuel is going to decrease over time, then it makes sense to stick with normal trucks because they're going to cost less. And so there's no right answer here. The goal of this kind of question is really to test your thinking, and whatever you present as your recommendation of should we invest in these hybrid trucks or not to the interviewer, just make sure that it's backed up by data and a clear, reasonable line of thinking so that they can see like how you think about this kind of question. I still haven't talked through all of the no buckets, but just to go through them quickly, I essentially wrote down no cost benefit from the analysis, but then I sort of talked through why this would change based on the fuel price. And so I had no more economical if fuel decreases. And then the last bullet that I had here was higher maintenance expenses if you use these hybrid trucks. Because if you remember, if we scroll back up here, it's $8,000 a year. And it's also more expensive from an insurance perspective, actually. So I should note that down. And oftentimes these newer, more technologically advanced vehicles, like if you think about electric cars, for example, like a Tesla, the parts can be quite expensive and difficult to maintain because traditional auto shops or dealers or repair stores just don't have the specialized parts for EVs that they would have for traditional diesel or gas vehicles. And so that's another thing to consider as well. Okay, but let's take a step back. And so after we've put together this list of yes and no's, we would then want to basically explain to the interviewer each of these points that I've just explained to you. And so the way I would do this is I would say, okay, great. So I've put together a few points supporting, but also going against the use of these hybrid trucks. And before I make a recommendation as to whether I think we should or should not, I just want to lay these out so that you can fully understand what my thought process is and what's going through my mind. And they'll say, okay, great, go for it. And then you'll talk through each of these points really quickly. Don't ramble too much, just keep it high level. And then finally talk about whether you think you should invest in hybrid trucks or not. And in this scenario, I'm just going to pick the no bucket because I'm going to assume that the hybrid trucks were not superior in any other way. They couldn't carry more boxes, for example. They weren't more efficient. And I also didn't think that the fuel prices were going to increase by that dramatically given the current economic environment. And so let's just say that I went with no. And so I would say, Okay, great. So, and based on my understanding of all of these points, I would still recommend against investing in hybrid trucks because I don't believe that the fuel prices are going to increase that dramatically over the long term. And also because the hybrid trucks are much more expensive. And also because there's minimal advantage to using the hybrid trucks from an efficiency and carrying capacity perspective. And so I don't believe that, at least right now, it makes sense for us to invest upfront in these more costly trucks. And so just stop there and get the interviewer's thoughts. But usually after this, the interviewer will start guiding you to the next part of the question, which in this case is the brainstorm. And so the brainstorming problem reads, the client also wants to get our thoughts on how they can reduce their shortage of truckers. Brainstorm some ways national logistics can reduce their shortage. Okay, so brainstorming sections are quite common in case interviews, and they're really there to test your ability to just come up with ideas on the spot. And it's not so much about coming up with the right answer as it is coming up with a well thought out array of different answers or different solutions. And so don't be afraid also to take a few seconds here as well to come up with a few ideas if you don't feel like you can just come up with things on the fly. And so I would ask the interviewer, hey, can I take just another 30 seconds to put together some thoughts? And they would of course say yes. So let's do that. Okay, so I've thrown together a few ideas here that I'll just walk you through. And in no particular order, some things that the company could do here to reduce the trucker shortage is one, they could obviously try to increase wages, but here we know that that's probably not going to be a very feasible alternative. I've just put it here to be holistic. But two, they could also create other sorts of incentives to really attract people to work at the company and to retain their current employees. And so these could be things like, benefits for existing employees. Maybe that's increasing PTO or better health insurance, better parental leave policies, or more flexible vacation policies, for example. Maybe there's even like bonuses that truckers can get for successfully completing X number of routes in X amount of time, for example. Just throwing ideas out there. You could also create some sort of promotion to attract new people to become drivers, whether that's like a referral bonus for your current employees, like, hey, we'll pay you $4,000 if you refer a friend who gets hired to work at this trucking company. Or also, promotions that attract people to come work at your company, like, hey, join this trucking company where you're going to have better benefits than your competitors. And then the final thing that you can also do is you can go beyond just your company and look outside, and you could hire a third-party fleet of truckers to support increased demand during the holiday season, for example, or whenever you have any sort of shortages. These are just a few ideas that you could think of. The goal here is you just want to throw out as many ideas as you can and talk the interviewer through each idea. But finally, we've come to the conclusion of the case. And so at the end of every case, the interviewer will usually ask you to synthesize your findings. And synthesis is basically just looking through everything that you've learned today and summing it all up in a very concise recommendation in like 30 seconds. And so the typical way that it's presented to you here would be, imagine that the CEO of the company is walking down the hall and you're in a conference room and you have about 30 seconds to think through what you would say to the CEO and what you would recommend them. What would you tell them? And so you can take about like 20 to 30 seconds to really think through. And this is where I usually like to scroll back up and look through my notes and really think through everything that I've learned today, right? And a helpful format that I like to follow and that other colleagues of mine have also recommended is you always want to start with a quick restatement of the problem, state your findings, you want to provide a recommendation, and then you want to provide some risks, and finally end with next steps. And so I know that seems like kind of a lot, but the way that this would sound in practice is a lot more succinct. And so this is how I would go about it. Awesome. So as a reminder, we were tasked with thinking about how we could lower the operational costs of the business. And what we found is through our analysis of the different trucking options and paths forward, there is currently no advantage from a cost perspective of investing in a hybrid fleet as opposed to a standard fleet. However, this can change based on the fuel prices in the future. But since we don't see fuel prices increasing dramatically over the long term, we recommend sticking with a standard fleet because it's more economical at lower fuel prices. And we also recommend implementing policies to increase driver retention and attract new truckers to alleviate the shortage, as well as hiring outside help to support the heavy season. Now that said, the risk to this strategy is obviously gas prices potentially increasing more than we anticipate. as well as the possibility that our policies or our incentive programs may not work as well as planned, and we may run into a potential driver shortage, or potentially that hiring outside help may be more costly than anticipated. But as a potential next step, we would recommend looking into the cost of hiring outside help, just to analyze what it would take to really bring on that outside help and how feasible the implementation of that would be, as well as the other policies that we've mentioned with driving user retention and also implementing a new standard fleet of trucks. Okay, so that was the case. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.